The old man's voice cracked across the ballroom like a whip, and 200 people stopped breathing at the same time. "I told you not to bring her into my house." Roland Kessler stood beneath the chandelier the size of a small car, his face gone the deep red of a man who had never once in his life been told no. 63 years old, silver hair combed straight back, a tuxedo that cost more than most of the people watching would make in a month. He wasn't looking at the young woman in the plain navy dress. He was looking through her the way you look through a window you're about to break. Dad. Julian Kessler stepped in front of his wife. "She's my wife, you know that. Everyone here knows that. I know what she is." Roland's mouth curled. A cleaning woman in a borrowed dress, dragging somebody else's kid, playing at a life she has no business being near. "You gave up everything I built for this. This." The woman he was talking about did not flinch. Her name was Imani Rowe, and she stood very still, hands loose at her sides, chin level. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do to a man like Roland Kessler is refuse to give him the reaction he's paying for. "You have two choices, son." Roland's voice dropped, and somehow that was worse. "You walk out that door with her right now, and you walk out of the family with her. No trust, no name, nothing. Or you send her back to whatever gutter she came from, and we forget tonight ever happened." Julian looked at his father for a long moment. Then he took Imani's hand. "Then I guess I'm nobody's son." And here is the part nobody in that room understood yet. Not the guests filming on their phones. Not the wife standing frozen by the staircase. Not Roland Kessler himself, drunk on his own cruelty, certain he had just won. A car had pulled up outside 2 minutes earlier, and the man stepping out of it was about to take everything Roland Kessler had spent 40 years building and fold it up like a napkin. Stay with me. Because to understand how one of the wealthiest men in the state lost his empire in a single night, you have to back up about 7 hours, to a woman who never once told anyone who her father was. Imani Rowe finished her shift at Eastfield High at 3:40 that afternoon, the same as any other Friday. 33 years old, a choir and music teacher, the kind of tired that lives in your shoulders. Eastfield sat on the south end of the city, a building older than most of the teachers in it, where the pianos were out of tune and half the kids couldn't afford the $12 for a folder. Imani bought the folders herself. She bought a lot of things herself and never mentioned it. That afternoon she'd stayed late with a sophomore named Darius, who could sing like something out of a church you drove past on Sundays, and who was one bad semester away from dropping out. She sat with him at the beat-up upright and told him the same thing she told all of them. That where you start doesn't decide where you finish, that nobody gets to write your ending but you. She believed it. She'd built her whole life on believing it. Her phone buzzed as she was locking the choir room. "Julian, hey, I need to tell you something." She knew that tone even in text. It was the careful one, the one he only used when his father was in the picture. She leaned against the door and read the second message before it even came. "He says if you show up tonight, he'll make it ugly. In front of everyone." Imani closed her eyes. She had met Roland Kessler exactly 3 times in the 2 years she'd known Julian. The first time, at a lunch Julian arranged, Roland had spent 40 minutes talking to his son and not once looked directly at her, like she was a chair that had wandered in off the street. The second time, at a dinner he'd said to Julian, right across the table, loud enough for her to hear, "This is a phase. Boys have phases," as if she weren't sitting 18 inches away. The third time there was no meeting at all. A courier brought an envelope to her apartment. Inside was a check for $75,000 and a note typed on heavy cream paper. "For your discretion. It would be best for everyone if you moved on." She never cashed the check. She kept the note in the drawer of her nightstand, folded once, so she'd never forget exactly what Roland Kessler thought a person like her was worth. She texted Julian back. "It's fine. I'll stay home with Nia. Go, smooth it over." The reply came fast. "No, you're my wife. You have every right to be in that room. Your father doesn't see it that way. My father doesn't see a lot of things. That's his problem. Not ours. I bought you a dress. It's on the bed. Please come. She found the dress an hour later, after she'd picked up Nia from her friend Yolanda Sparks, and dropped her back off for the evening, 5 years old and gap-toothed, wildly proud of a drawing of a horse that looked mostly like a potato. Imani had taped it to the fridge, like it was hanging in a museum. The dress was navy blue, simple, and it fit her like it had been made for her, which meant Julian had paid attention, which meant she was going. She stood in front of the mirror and touched the thin gold chain at her throat. On it hung her mother's wedding band, worn smooth, engraved on the inside with 2 letters most people would never read. She tucked it under the neckline the way she always did, so no one could see it. Then she looked at herself for a long moment. Here is the thing Imani Rowe had never told a soul at Eastfield High, not the principal, not Julian's family, barely even Julian. Her mother was Delphine Rowe. To most of the world that name meant nothing. To a certain generation it meant everything. A soprano who had integrated concert halls that didn't want her, who walked off a stage in Atlanta rather than sing to a segregated balcony, who spent the second half of her life building music programs in schools that had nothing. Delphine died when Imani was 20. Breast cancer, fast and merciless. Imani still couldn't hear certain hymns without leaving the room, and her father. Her father was a man named Solomon Rowe. Solomon had done 2 tours in the Marine Corps as a young man, come home and started buying things nobody else wanted. A parking lot here. A crumbling hotel there. 40 years later, he sat at the top of Rowe Meridian Capital, one of the largest privately held real estate and infrastructure firms in the country. The kind of man who owned the ground that other rich men's buildings stood on. The kind of man whose name made bankers straighten their ties. Imani had spent her entire adult life making sure no one ever connected her to it. She used her mother's maiden name. She'd turned down the money, the connections, the shortcut that was always sitting right there for the taking. She'd worked her way through a state school on scholarships and night jobs, gotten her teaching license, taken the hardest school in the district on purpose. She wanted, more than she wanted almost anything, to know that whatever she had, she'd earned it with her own 2 hands, that no one could ever look at her and say she'd been handed a thing. So she drove her 9-year-old Subaru with the cracked bumper across town to a hotel worth more than most people's neighborhoods, and she walked in through the front doors with her head up. The Ardenmoor was the crown jewel of Kessler Hospitality Group, a 100-year-old grand hotel that Roland had gutted and rebuilt into a monument to himself, and tonight was its reopening gala. 200 guests. Senators, developers, the kind of old money that talks quietly and the kind of new money that doesn't. Marble floors. White orchids in urns taller than a child. A string quartet in the corner playing something that cost extra. Julian met her in the lobby and the relief on his face nearly broke her heart. He looked wrong in his tuxedo, too handsome and too scared, 35 years old, and still bracing for his father like a boy waiting for a door to slam. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yeah," she said. "I did." They lasted about 20 minutes before Roland found them. He came across the floor with a glass of bourbon and a smile that had nothing warm in it, and the guest nearby went quiet the way animals go quiet when something bigger walks into the clearing. His wife, Meredith Kessler, drifted a step behind him in silver silk, 58, beautiful in a hard, lacquered way, a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly when to say nothing. Julian. Roland didn't look at Imani. "I asked you for one thing tonight." "Dad, not here. Where else?" Roland turned, finally, and let his eyes travel down Imani and back up like he was pricing a used car. "You know, I actually admire the nerve. Most people in your position know their place. You just keep showing up Kessler," Imani said evenly. "It's good to see you." "Don't," he said it flat. "Don't do the voice. Don't do the dress. I know what you are. I had you looked into the week my son lost his mind over you. A schoolteacher, a single mother, a woman who cleans up other people's messes for a living." He smiled at his own guests, playing to the room now, and a few of them laughed the nervous laugh of people who don't want to be next. "And now she wants to clean up in my family." Julian's voice shook. That's enough. It's my house. It's a hotel. Roland's smile vanished. And this is where a man like Roland Kessler always goes, once the polish comes off. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, several pages, and held it up for the room. You want to know what I think of this marriage? He looked at Imani. I had my lawyers draw this up this morning. A very generous settlement. You sign it. You and the child are taken care of for life, and you disappear. Quietly, everybody wins. He held it out to her like he was doing her a favor. Imani looked at the papers. She did not reach for them. No thank you, she said. For a second, Roland actually looked surprised. Then his fist closed like a fist. You ungrateful. Julian took the document out of his father's hand, and in front of 200 of the most important people in the state, he tore it in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall onto the marble, and he didn't watch them land. The room made a sound. Not a word. Just a collective intake of breath. Roland stared at the paper on the floor. When he looked up, something in him had gone past anger into something colder. Get out. His voice carried to every corner. Both of you. You want her? You've got her. You get nothing else. Not a dollar, not the name, not a single thing I ever gave you. As of right now, you have no father. He pointed at the doors, a king banishing a peasant. Go. And here is the part I want you to remember later. Meredith Kessler was standing 4 feet away. She had watched her husband call her son's wife trash. She had watched him try to buy her off and disown her only child in front of the entire world. And she said nothing. She stood there with her pearls and her silver dress and her lacquered face, and she let it happen. And when Julian looked at her, really looked at her, waiting, begging with his eyes for one word, she looked down at the floor. Mom, Julian said quietly. Say something. Meredith lifted her chin. Your father loves you, Julian. One day you'll understand he's doing this for your own good. Something in Julian's face broke. Not loud. Just a thread, snapping, that had been pulled too tight for too long. No, he said. One day you'll understand what you just did. He took Imani's hand and turned his back on both of them, and the two of them walked out through the crowd. Nobody stopped them. 200 powerful people, and the bravest thing any of them managed was to step aside. The foyer outside the ballroom was cool and quiet, the noise of the party dropping away behind the heavy doors. Imani leaned against the wall and finally let her hands shake. They'd been shaking the whole time. She just refused to let anyone see. Julian pressed his forehead against the paneling. I have nothing now, he said. He actually did it. He cut me off. You have me, Imani said. You have Nia. That's not nothing, Julian. That's the only thing that was ever real. He turned to look at her, his eyes wet. I thought if he just met you, if he just saw you, I really believed. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, she said gently. Nothing I did in there was ever going to change that. Some people decide who you are before you open your mouth. They stood like that for a while. Then Julian said the thing he'd been circling all night. Should I call your dad? Imani went still. She touched the chain at her throat, her mother's ring warm against her skin. She thought about the last 20 years. Every door she'd opened herself. Every argument she'd won on her own. Every single thing she owned, earned, her name, and no one else's. But tonight wasn't about any of that. Tonight a man had stood in a room and torn her marriage, her child, and her dignity to pieces, while 200 people watched and did nothing. Tonight wasn't about her pride anymore. I'll call him, she said. Myself. She took her phone out of her clutch. Her hands were still trembling. Her voice was not. It rang twice. Then a low, calm voice, the kind of voice that fills a room just by answering a phone. Hey, sweetheart, Dad. And her voice cracked on the one word, all of it threatening to come apart at once. I know, Solomon Rose said, before she could say anything else. Julian called me 40 minutes ago. I've been sitting in the driveway for 10 of them. Imani blinked. You're, what? I've been out here trying to decide something. She could hear the faint smile in it. Whether to walk in there as a businessman or as your father. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh. What did you decide? Your father, Solomon said. Businessmen negotiate. Fathers don't. The line went dead. Imani looked at Julian. Julian looked at Imani. From outside, through the tall front doors, came the sound of a car door closing and then footsteps on stone. Unhurried, even. The footsteps of a man who had walked into rooms far more dangerous than this one and walked out of every single one. The doorbell rang, one long, deliberate chime that rolled across the marble like something out of an old film. And inside the ballroom, Roland Kessler was still smiling, still holding court, still warming himself at the fire of his own cruelty, surrounded by 200 people too frightened to tell him he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. He had no idea who was standing on the other side of that door. He was about to find out. Imani opened the front door, and Solomon Rowe stepped inside. 61 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had never once let himself go soft. Silver hair cut close, a charcoal suit with no flash to it, no jewelry, one small enamel pin on the lapel, a Marine Corps emblem worn smooth with age. He carried no phone in his hand, no drink, nothing. Just himself, and that turned out to be more than enough. He looked at his daughter first, took her face in both his hands and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You okay?" She nodded. If she spoke, she'd fall apart, and she wasn't ready yet. He turned to Julian and held out his hand, then held the grip a beat longer than a handshake. "You did right by her in there, son. I heard most of it. I'm proud of you." Julian's throat worked. He couldn't answer. He just nodded. Solomon straightened his jacket, adjusted the pin on his lapel, and looked toward the ballroom doors, where the muffled hum of 200 voices leaked through the wood. "Which one is he?" "You can't miss him," Imani said. "Good." Solomon's voice was calm as a still lake. "Let's go introduce ourselves." He pushed both doors open at once. Wide. They swung back and hit the walls, and the sound of it cut through every conversation in the room like a blade. Heads turned. The string quartet stumbled and stopped mid-phrase. Solomon Rowe walked into that ballroom the way certain men walk into a room they already own. Slow, unbothered, every step saying the same thing without a single word. "I am not here to ask anyone's permission." Roland was near the bar, refreshed bourbon in hand, laughing at something with a developer. He glanced toward the disturbance at the doors, and the laugh died in his throat. Because Roland Kessler recognized that face. Not from family photos, not from Imani, who'd never shown him one. He recognized it from a magazine cover in his own study, Rowe Meridian, the quiet giant. He recognized it from a charity dinner 2 years back where he'd stood in a receiving line for half an hour, hoping for 30 seconds of this man's time and never gotten them. He recognized it from the framed photograph in his own general counsel's office, the one of Solomon Rowe shaking hands with the governor. The color drained out of Roland's face in stages. First, the bourbon flush. Then, the certainty in his jaw. Then, last, the wide-eyed dawning of a man realizing the floor is no longer under his feet. Solomon crossed the room. The crowd parted without being asked. They didn't know who he was, not most of them, but every single one of them knew what real authority looked like when it walked toward you. He stopped directly in front of Roland, close so that Roland had to look up to meet his eyes. "Roland Kessler." He said it like reading a name off a file. "We've almost met. Twice. You waited half an hour to shake my hand at the Whitfield Foundation dinner, and your office called mine 3 times last spring about a ground lease renewal. I believe the word your people used was urgent." Roland's mouth opened. Nothing came out. A drop of bourbon slid over the rim of his glass and landed on his polished shoe. Over by the bar, Malcolm Reed, Kessler Hospitality's general counsel, 50-something, sharp as a razor, closed his eyes. He'd known for 20 minutes. A news alert on his phone. Rowe Meridian chairman confirmed at Ardenmoor reopening. He had not warned his boss. Lawyers always know exactly when to start building distance from a sinking ship. Solomon went on, and he never once raised his voice. He didn't have to. The dead silence of 200 people did the work for him. "My daughter," he let the word land. "The woman you just called trash. The woman you tried to buy off in front of your friends. The woman you ordered out of this room. Her name is Imani Delphine Rowe. She has a master's degree she paid for herself. She teaches music to children this city forgot about. In a school you wouldn't let your dog sleep in. She has never once, in her entire life, used my name to open a door. She wanted to earn everything on her own. He paused. And she did. Every single thing she has, she built with her own hands, which is more than I can say for you or for anyone in this room. He reached into his jacket and took out a single card. Cream, heavy stock. He set it on the bar in front of Roland with two steady fingers. Solomon A. Rowe, Chairman, Rowe Meridian Capital. Roland looked at the card, and Roland understood. Because Rowe Meridian held the ground lease under the Ardenmoor, the very floor they were standing on. It held the senior debt on two more Kessler flagship properties. Together, those three buildings were nearly half of everything Kessler Hospitality Group was worth. If Solomon Rowe declined to renew a lease, if he called a note, the whole thing came down like a tower of glasses when you pull the bottom one out. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Because Solomon Rowe also sat on the State Development Authority that was in 6 weeks scheduled to vote on the biggest project of Roland's life, a $400 million resort that Roland had already borrowed against, already announced, already staked his legacy on. Roland Kessler's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the bar with both hands. The bourbon glass slipped out of his fingers and shattered on the marble, sharp and final, like a verdict being read. 200 people stood in absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Roland tried to rebuild his face, the CEO face, the patriarch face. It wouldn't fit anymore. It had shattered with the glass. General, Mr. Rowe. His voice came out thin and reedy, a sound no one in that room had ever heard from Roland Kessler. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea. No idea she was somebody's daughter? Solomon's voice stayed quiet, which somehow made it land harder. Or no idea anyone who mattered would ever find out how you treat the people you think are beneath you. The things I said they were, it's an emotional night. Family gets heated. You had your lawyers draft a settlement this morning. Solomon didn't blink. You planned this. You froze your son's accounts before the party even started. That isn't heat, Roland. That's a man who thought this through and did it anyway. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice settling in abandoned drinks. Roland's eyes darted around the ballroom, searching for a single ally. Developers looked at their shoes. Senators found the ceiling very interesting. 200 faces, and not one of them stepped forward for him. Meredith crossed the room then, heels clicking, and stood at her husband's side. She turned to Solomon with a practiced smile, smooth as glass. Mr. Rowe, surely this can be handled privately. Once cooler heads, Mrs. Kessler. Solomon cut her off without heat. I watched you stand by that staircase and say nothing while your husband humiliated my daughter and threw away your son. Do not talk to me about cooler heads. Meredith's smile came apart like wet paper. Solomon took out his phone and dialed. He put it on speaker, and the whole room heard it ring. Miles, it's Solomon. I want a full review of every Rowe Meridian position tied to Kessler Hospitality. The Ardenmoor lease, the 2 notes, all of it, and pull the file on their Development Authority application. I want it on my desk Monday, 8 a.m. He listened a moment. Yeah, all of it. He hung up and looked at Roland, who had sunk against the bar like something with the bones taken out. 48 hours. Solomon's voice was almost gentle now, and that was the most frightening part. You resign as CEO. You issue a real apology, not something your lawyers write at 3 in the morning. And you step away from every dollar that has my name anywhere near it. If I don't see movement by Monday, my people handle the rest. He let it sit. And Roland, my people don't lose. Roland's legs gave out. He folded into the nearest chair and put his head in his hands. For the first time all night, Roland Kessler had nothing to say. And then something happened that no one expected. An old woman rose from a corner table. Adele Kessler. Roland's older sister, 74. The one the family didn't talk about. The one Roland had cut off decades ago for marrying a man he considered common. She'd come tonight anyway, for the free look at the hotel and nothing else. She crossed the floor slowly, on a cane, and she stopped in front of Imani, and there were tears on her face. I should have said something years ago, Adele said, her voice unsteady, Every time. Tonight, I'm so sorry, dear. This family has been rotten a long time, and I let it be. Imani took the old woman's hands. Thank you, she said, and meant it. It was the first decent thing a Kessler had done all night. It took a catastrophe to produce it. Solomon put his arm around his daughter. Julian stepped to her other side, and the three of them walked out of that ballroom together, unhurried, while behind them Roland Kessler slumped in a chair too small for a man whose empire had just become too big to save. And 200 people reached for their phones, not to help. To tell the story, the first video hit the internet at 11:40 that night. Nobody ever figured out exactly who filmed it. Somebody near the front, close enough to catch Roland's voice clean over the champagne clink. Every word survived. Roland calling Imani trash. Roland telling a schoolteacher she had no business in his family. Roland disowning his own son in front of 200 witnesses. By 2 in the morning, it had 4 million views. By sunrise, it was on every network in the country, running on a loop, the kind of clip that stops a nation mid-scroll. The headline that stuck came from a reporter named Andre Colson, who'd spent a decade chasing stories about how the rich treat the people who serve them. His piece ran Monday at 7 a.m. in the Ledger. Hospitality titan caught on camera berating son's wife, who happens to be the daughter of the man who owns his hotels. But Colson didn't just have the video. He'd been working sources inside Kessler Hospitality for months, and the clip cracked everything open. Housekeepers came forward, then front desk staff, then a former assistant manager, a black woman named Deneen Carter, who described being passed over for a promotion 4 times despite the best guest scores in the building. Others followed. Stories about scheduling that always seemed to punish the same people, about a culture fit standard that everyone understood and no one wrote down. A wage theft complaint from the housekeeping floor that HR had quietly buried 2 years earlier resurfaced, and this time nobody buried it. Kessler Hospitality stock, the group had gone public years back, opened Monday down 11%. By Tuesday's close, it had shed 24%. Institutional investors and pension funds started pulling out, not because they'd suddenly grown a conscience, but because a public relations fire is bad for quarterly numbers. The board called an emergency session Tuesday night. They voted 9-2 to demand Roland's resignation. The 2 who abstained were his own appointees, and even they couldn't bring themselves to defend him. The motion passed clean on the second ballot. Roe Meridian issued a statement Wednesday morning, 3 paragraphs, cold and precise as a scalpel. It said the firm was reviewing all of its commitments to Kessler Hospitality, that it did not partner with organizations whose leadership demonstrated conduct incompatible with its values, and that further decisions would follow. 2 other lenders moved within the day. The Development Authority quietly pulled the resort application from its agenda. Roland spent 24 hours in his study, calling board members one at a time, trying to negotiate, threaten, charm his way back. Nobody picked up. Every call went to voicemail. The silence on the other end of those lines was louder than anything Roland Kessler had ever heard. Meredith finally ended it. She walked into his study Wednesday night in her robe and said 7 words. "If you fight this, we lose everything." He resigned Thursday morning. The apology went out that afternoon. Navy suit, careful lighting, a teleprompter he read from like a man reading his own obituary. He said he regretted his remarks. He said they didn't reflect his values or his company's. He said he was committed to growth. The internet answered the way it always answers, an apology that arrives only after the money's gone. He's sorry he got caught. Growth? Sir, you're 63. A clip of his face fading into a collapsing building made the rounds for a week. Here's where everyone landed, 6 months on. Roland Kessler never sat in a corner office again. A federal labor investigation into Kessler Hospitality ended in a consent decree. Mandatory anti-discrimination training, an independent compliance monitor, quarterly reports to the government for 5 years. A class action suit brought by 14 former employees, most of them black and brown women from the housekeeping and service floors, settled for $41 million, the largest of its kind in the hospitality industry that year. Roland's personal fortune dropped from a little over $1 billion to somewhere south of $400 million after the crash and the fees. He sold the estate and moved to a modest house 2 hours north. Court records show he completed a court-ordered program on bias and workplace conduct. He attended every session. He sat in the back row. He said nothing, and learned the kind of thing about human dignity that most decent people understand by the age of 5. Meredith Kessler filed for divorce 4 months later. In her deposition, she testified that Roland had used slurs freely and often in private for 30 years, and that she'd stayed silent out of financial dependence, not agreement. The court was generous with her. She moved to Florida, dropped the Kessler name, and never spoke of it again. Julian Kessler was offered the interim CEO job by a board desperate for a new face. He took it on the condition that Imani have no involvement whatsoever. He wanted to earn it the same way she'd earned everything in her life, on his own. He rebuilt the company's hiring from the ground up. He funded a program that trained and promoted from the service floors. He named Deneen Carter to run guest operations across every property, a job she'd been passed over for 4 times. Within 18 months, the stock had recovered and then some. When a reporter asked what had changed, Julian gave an answer that became its own headline. The people at the top, everything good was already here. It was just never allowed to breathe. Imani Rowe went back to Eastfield High the Monday after the gala. She clocked in at 7:15. She put on her lanyard and unlocked the choir room, and spent first period with a sophomore named Darius, who could sing like a Sunday morning, telling him again that where you start doesn't decide where you finish. When a reporter tracked down her cell and asked for a comment about the man who'd tried to destroy her, she said 6 words that ran on 3 networks by nightfall. "My students have a concert Friday." Then she hung up. Solomon Rowe endowed a foundation with $20 million and named it after his late wife. The Delphine Rowe Fund, for arts education in schools the system had left behind. Pianos got tuned, folders got bought, kids who'd never touched an instrument got to. Imani helped design the whole thing and let them list her only as an advisor. Julian and Imani renewed their vows on a Saturday in October. 30 people, a backyard in a plain neighborhood, not a ballroom in sight. Solomon walked his daughter across the grass. No Kesslers were invited except Adele, who came early on her cane, carrying a handwritten letter and a stuffed rabbit for Nia. Nia was the flower girl. She threw the petals with tremendous concentration, then turned to the guests and announced, at full volume, "My grandpa buys pianos and my mom teaches kids to sing." Nobody corrected her. She was exactly right on both counts. So here's what I want to leave you with. There's a moment in every one of these stories where the room goes quiet and everybody has a choice: to step forward or to look at their shoes. 200 people were in that ballroom the night Roland Kessler tried to break a woman for the crime of not being born rich, and almost every one of them chose their shoes. Only one old woman on a cane finally stood up, and it took her 74 years to do it. I'm not going to pretend I know which one I'd have been. I'd like to think I'd have said something. Most of us would like to think that. But that's the whole point, isn't it? Because the way you treat somebody when you're certain nobody important is watching, that, right there, is the only true thing anyone ever knows about you. Roland Kessler found out the hard way that there's no such thing as nobody important. Every single person you look down on is somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody the whole world just hasn't recognized yet. And if you're the one who's ever been told you're not enough, not rich enough, not polished enough, not the right kind of person for the room, I want you to hear me. The problem was never you. It was always them. The right people don't make you prove your worth. They see it the moment you walk in. So let me ask you what I ask every time. If you'd been standing in that ballroom watching it happen, would you have looked at your shoes? Or would you have been the one person brave enough to step forward? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story moved you, if it made you angry or hopeful or a little bit braver, Go ahead and hit that like button, share it with somebody who needs it tonight, and subscribe, because there's another one just like it coming next week. Real stories, real reckonings, every single time.